Happy Monday, everybody. I am Bill Tucker, and I'm with Pastor Zach McIntosh, and this is Isolation Bible Study on a kind of a dreary, rainy, gloomy Monday. Seems like an appropriate context to talk about depression, doesn't it?
Yes, I'm looking out the window, and there's plenty of rain, which actually is a good thing because we can always use a little bit of that. But it is definitely not only rainy but very dreary outside.
So, these last 2 weeks on Sunday morning, we have been working our way through this mini series called Peace of Mind. And it has to do with the whole issue of mental health, and in very specifically the issue of depression. Now, we haven't been trying to do a diagnosis of depression. We've really been talking about the issue of depression, discouragement, sadness, the blues, all of that from the context of Elijah's life in 1 Kings chapter 19. And then during our isolation Bible study on Mondays, as we normally do, we've been kind of recapping the message and adding some additional kind of bonus points, as we call them. But then we've been having other studies that also talk about various aspects of mental health. So on Friday, for example, we had a pre-recorded session with Pastor Mark Schultz. It was a great study. And again, folks, I hope you enjoyed it and were blessed by it. Mark is a great teacher and preacher. And so that's available. If you didn't get to see it, of course, you can find that in the archives. But then we also have coming up this week, and I'm not sure which day is which, but on Wednesday and Friday, we'll have pre-recorded sessions. One with Pastor Dave McKnight, and he's going to do a session very specifically on suicide intervention. When you're concerned, when you have a fear that someone is suicidal, how to deal with that. And I will tell you that it's a very simple, kind of down-to-earth teaching, but so practical because it's almost overwhelming to think about being in that situation. And with just a little bit of instruction and encouragement from Pastor Dave, I think folks will feel like they at least have an idea of how to respond. So a really valuable teaching. And then Paul Teskey is going to share with us a teaching as well. And so Wednesday and Friday should be great isolation Bible studies. But today, Zach, we're going to hearken back to part 2, the concluding message of this Peace of Mind series, where we were talking about the spiritual aspects of depression.
Yeah, so week one, we were very, very kind of clinical in some sense, right? We talked about some of the things that a lot of counselors will tell you if you're struggling with depression. We talked about, the relationship between your body and your mind and your spirit, and how Elijah, who is one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament nation of Israel, when he gets down in the dumps, when he is very depressed, one of the things that happens is an angel meets him, and the angel makes sure that he gets some rest, get some food, and get some exercise. The angel makes sure that he's not alone, because a lot of times when you're depressed, you tend to want to isolate rather than to congregate. And one of the worst things for depression sometimes is just being alone with your thoughts. And so there's a little bit of community there. There's a little bit of physical help there. But now this weekend, we transition into the second part of the story, which, as you mentioned before we got started, is from 1 Kings 19, where we get to the spiritual side of depression. And you mentioned this in your message. There are two mistakes that people make. There are some people who look at depression strictly from a clinical standpoint, and the clinical standpoint is incredibly important. Counselors are incredibly important. Psychologists and psychiatrists are incredibly important. Listening to their guidance, even if sometimes that means some sort of medication regimen, is incredibly important. But we're not just physical beings, and we're not just beings who have thoughts. We're created in the image of God, which means that one of the greatest comforts that we can have when we're in a depressive state is actually being met by the Lord who created us and cares for us, which is exactly what happens in the second part of the story in Elijah's life in 1 Kings 19.
Before we dig into that, let's also put this in the context. We framed this up by hearkening back to a series we did several years ago called Soul Keeping. And in that series on soul keeping, we defined the soul as being the total of all we are. So it's our body, it's our mind, it's our spirit, it's the things that happen to us. It's every part of our life comprises the soul. It's all part of the soul. And so when we're struggling and in one part of our life, it causes our soul to struggle. So at its heart, mental illness and or depression is a sickness or an injury to the soul.
Yeah, the soul is the thing that kind of holds us all together, and one of the parts, right, that it holds together is the spiritual part of us, what the New Testament will refer to as our spirit. And so we went through a few myths yesterday, and the first myth was this: that if you're spiritual, or if you're faithful, if you're religious, if you go to church, whatever you want to call it, then you won't get depressed because you have faith. And everything's going to be fine. You can turn that frown upside down. You can be happy all the time. That's not true at all. So we looked at this in Elijah's life, right? He is this towering giant of spirituality, this theologically insightful man who actually says to God in 1 Kings 19, verse 4, "Take my life. I've had enough, Lord." And so a faithful man who gets depressed, but it's not just as you talked about, it's not just Elijah. Moses went through the same thing. In Numbers 11, verse 15, Moses said to God, "Please go ahead and kill me," because leading the people of Israel was just becoming overwhelming for him. He was what we would call in today's modern day parlance, burnt out. And he falls into depression, and he's just kind of done. And even Jesus, the night before he goes to the cross, he has these amazing words where he says in Mark 14, verse 34, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow." Sorrow that's so deep it's all the way to the point of death. That's depression. That's heavy stuff. The perfectly faithful one who always did God's will, even he struggled. He went through this issue, this concern, this burden.
Well, and it's interesting to think about that, because we even cited other examples, Paul and Jonah, and there are other instances in the Bible where things happen. And when we consider this as being an injury or a sickness of the soul, there are so many things that can injure our soul. And sometimes it takes a physical, it manifests itself physically. And of course, depression can be a physical illness as well. But all of those things can create discouragement. Something that somebody says to us, something that happens, the news that we listen to. I mean, there are so many different ways. And so I think it's important for us to bust that myth and say, hey, listen, faithful people can be depressed. Depression does not discriminate.
In fact, just let's take this one little step farther. If something has happened that has kind of sent you into a spiral of depression, and maybe you feel like it's rocked your faith a little bit, you're not the only one who has been through this. In fact, one of the amazing things about prayer or about struggles in faith is you see all these examples. In fact, if you haven't read through the book of Acts, it's really worth a read, of people who have terrible things happen to them, people who are persecuted, right? And then they pray to the very God who allowed all those things to happen to them for help when those things happen to them. Now, that's kind of a hard sell when it comes to faith. If you're going through a hard time, it can feel real like your faith is getting shaky or weak, or like, God, why did you let this happen to me? All of those questions are natural, and you're not the first person to ask them. And so don't be afraid to ask them, and don't be afraid to ask them to others. And so if your faith is rocked because you're in depression, you don't have to be afraid to say that, and you don't have to be afraid to reach out for some help.
Well, and I would just turn that what you just said on its head. You have to be afraid if you don't talk about it, if you don't reach out for help. So that was myth number one. Faithful people don't get depressed. Not true. That's a lie. Myth number two was you can fight your way out of depression. In other words, you can just kind of dig deep and tough it out and sort of white knuckle your way through depression. That's not true either.
So Elijah, right before he gets depressed, has just come off this massive victory where he sets up this big contest between himself and a bunch of prophets of a false god named Baal. And Elijah wins the contest hands down. He says, okay, whichever God answers from heaven with fire, he's like the real deal. The other God, yeah, he's not the real deal at all. And so, of course, the prophets of Baal, when they cry out to Baal, asking Baal to send fire from heaven, all they get are crickets. When Elijah asks for the God of Israel to send down fire from heaven, he gets lots of fire, right? Burns up the altar, burns up the sacrifice, burns up the water that he put on the altar, burns up pretty much everything. It is kind of the ultimate God Almighty fireworks show. And so he's winning, right? He's fighting and he's winning. He's on top of the world, except that he tumbles right down into the valley. Because just because you have a lot of wins in your corner, right? Just because you've been able to fight and defeat and conquer, doesn't guarantee that you're going to be fine. And so if your most victorious moments don't guarantee that you're not going to get depressed, just being victorious again is not going to dig you out of depression.
Yeah, and there are lots and lots of examples. And I would think sometimes we don't know, right? Sometimes people struggle with depression in secret, which again, we don't advise that and don't suggest that. But there's also a certain confidentiality about any of our health issues that we want to maintain. And so you may not realize, but there are lots of very successful people, lots of people who everyone looks at and thinks that they have the world by the tail, who are battling depression, who do a good job of covering it up, who maybe are getting help and finding a way through this in a healthy way, but still struggle with depression. And so it's not about how tough we are. It's not about how tenacious we are. It's not about how absolutely brilliant we are. It is about the fact that our souls can suffer an injury that causes us to slip into depression.
And so victory is not a bulwark against depression. And so if you, and again, it's one of those things where, let's say you have been very successful, you may be tempted to beat yourself up and go, well, I shouldn't feel this way because I have everything I've ever wanted or needed or whatever. Depression, it's kind of like joy is not based on your circumstances. It's a gift from God. Depression doesn't have to be based on your circumstances either. It could be something clinical. It can be something else. And getting help with that is critical. Now, third myth that we talked about is God's power to get out of depression. That's all you need. Now, we probably need to make sure that we're not leading anyone astray here. Is God's power good? You bet it is. Is God's power needed? You bet it is. Is God's power a guarantee that everything is going to be just fine? No. And this is where Elijah's a little naive, right? Because he thinks that if he can just get God's power to fall down from heaven in the form of fire when he does that contest with the prophets of Baal, here's what's going to happen. Everybody around him is going to go, oh, that's pretty incredible. God is God, Baal is not. We're all good. We're done here. And it works that way for a split second. The people fall down and worship. And then after that, they go right back to their paganism. Because it's not just about an impressive fireworks show. It's not just about God's power. It's about the human heart. And the human heart cannot be changed by sheer dint of power alone, which is why when God comes to Elijah again, he comes to him in a few different ways. He comes to him in like a big windstorm, very powerful, right? Comes to him in like lots of fire, kind of like with the prophets of Baal. But then finally, he shows up in a gentle whisper. And that's what helps Elijah, because the question of depression is not, is God big enough and powerful enough? It's, is God small enough and gentle enough to meet you where you're at? And that's what God does with Elijah.
And that's really kind of the point. We're not saying that God's power isn't significant, important, that it can't help or heal depression. What we're saying is the power that we need is the power of God's love, the power of God, his acceptance and his presence with us and his care and devotion to us. Almighty God being willing to focus on little bitty me. That's different than the idea of the rocks breaking apart. It's different than the fire consuming the sacrifice. It's different than the wind that blows through and makes a big hullabaloo. It's a different aspect of God's power. But what I love about it is that power is made clear to us in the person of Jesus. Jesus is God's whisper.
And that is so incredibly important because he is the one, right, who ultimately gives us hope. He is the one who, from a cross, shows us just how gentle God is. He subjects himself to the ultimate power of Rome, right, to the ultimate power of his enemies. And the funny thing is, even for all their power, they just wind up losing. Because there's something, it's kind of counterintuitive, but there's something more powerful than power. And that is indeed love. That is indeed that gentle whisper. And so what we think of as power isn't always the most powerful thing. Now, how about some bonus points, huh?
Yeah, let's dig in. So we've got 3 bonus
Yeah.
points for you, and fire away.
All right. So just a couple of, and these are just very practical things, the first two of them, especially, but the third one is very important as well. The first one is this: if you are struggling with depression, remember that depression has a funny way of opening you up to dangerous people. Here's what I mean by that. If you're feeling worthless, or if you're feeling down in the dumps, or if you're not just feeling anything at all, there are some people, and we need to be honest about this. It's sad, but it's true, who are not there to help you. They're there to capitalize on that and to take advantage of you, to use you, to abuse you, to lie to you, to betray you. If you go back to the beginning of 1 Kings 19, this is pretty much what Jezebel is able to capitalize on with Elijah. This is 1 Kings 19, verses 1 and 2. Ahab, who's Jezebel's husband, told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, how he had conquered all the prophets of Baal with the sword. He had killed them all. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I don't make your life like that of one of them." And Elijah freaks out, runs away, goes into a totally depressive state. Well, how is Jezebel able to get the best of him? Well, it's because Elijah is struggling with depression. It's because Elijah has just come down off the high of this giant win against the prophets of Baal. And so he's very vulnerable. And so if you're in a depressive state, here's the thing: there are people who can help you, there are people who can hurt you. Be wise and know the difference. In fact, I'll often put it like this: some of the abusive relationships that I see, and they're tragic, and they rip my heart up. But abusive relationships often involve at least one, if not two, depressed people. The person who's being abused but doesn't want to leave because they derive their worth from the other person. That's a depressed state, and it can do so much damage. And so if you're in kind of a dangerous person relationship, and if you are feeling worthless, just try to find at least one not dangerous person.
Well, and that goes, Zach, to something that we talk about frequently, and that is the idea of accountability partners. Because accountability partners are people that love us, people who know us, people who accept us for our good and our bad. But they're people who are also courageous enough to tell us the truth. And when we have accountability partners, those folks can serve as a barometer to say to us, listen, what's going on with you and so and so, or this person that you're dating, it doesn't seem healthy to me. They can approach us about things. We may not like what they say, we may not trust necessarily what they say as being true, but we trust them, and we trust them enough to know that they're going to love us. And when they say difficult things to us, we need to really think about it and pray about it. Again, it's not saying that they're always right in their perception, but it is saying they love us enough to have a perception and to talk to us about concerns that they may have. In the same way, when we have accountability partners and they say, wow, that's awesome, or what I see happening in that relationship is so encouraging, they're really good for you, we can rejoice in that because, again, they love us enough to tell us the truth. And when they tell us things that are good or things that we want to hear, that's an affirmation of our direction.
The other thing I think it's important for us to recognize is that dangerous people come at all stages of life, right? I think about elderly folks who are often taken advantage of, probably because, in some sense, they may not be on the lookout for people who are manipulative, but then in the other sense, they may be lonely, especially during this COVID-19 time where they're isolated maybe from normal family members they were able to see, they're no longer able to see. And all it takes is that one phone call from that one person who seems really nice on the phone, right? And they may have something to sell or a problem they're trying to solve. And then they get taken advantage of in huge ways. We see this all the time in both marriages and in dating relationships. But then we also see this, parents, with our own kids. You probably, especially if your kids are in that middle school or high school age, you may be worried about one of your kids' friends because you don't really see this as a healthy relationship. You know what? If that's where you're at as a parent, especially for your kids, get some help. Be on the lookout, pay close attention, because your child who's struggling right now with a little bit of depression, if they fall in with the wrong person, that depression can be much deeper, much quicker. And in fact, check on those, especially if you're kind of in that middle stage of life. Check on those who are your parents, your grandparents, make sure they're doing okay. Check on those who are your children, and then get accountability for yourself.
And this one more word of warning: be on the lookout when it comes to online and any kind of technology. You know, I get a message, and I've been getting a message probably once every other day. It's a scam. Someone has my phone number, and they've been sending a message that says if I click on a link, there's some kind of prize or something from Amazon or who knows what. Well, when I click on that link, it exposes me to danger. I've talked to my sweet mom, and she has gotten calls probably at least once a month from someone who's trying to scam her, someone who's trying to get her to send money or to do something. In fact, sometimes they claim to be one of my kids, one of her grandkids, who's calling. They're just in an accident. Grandma, can you send money? Well, after a few times, she's learned to ask some questions that will help protect her. But parents, when it comes to your children, don't assume that they have the ability to discern. Monitor what they're doing on their phone, monitor what they're doing online, because online, and by the way, that includes gaming sites where you play with groups of people. The online world is not a safe world. It requires diligent supervision for children and those who are not able to always discern for themselves.
And so, lots of dangerous people out there. And we don't mean this to be a downer point, but it's a real one. And it's sometimes you just got to say the hard stuff as a reminder for us all, because I think a lot of us already knew this, but it's a reminder for us all to be on the lookout so that we don't make a bad problem worse. And that's where it's coming from. Okay, so depression opens you up to dangerous people.
Speaking of a downer session, Zach.
Yeah.
What's point number 2?
Yeah.
Bonus point
well,
2.
And this is the flip side of it. It doesn't have to be a person to be dangerous. Depression can also open you up to dangerous habits. Now, this is kind of a takeoff of the first point. And the fact of the matter is, people will try all sorts of tricks to solve their depression. And most of the tricks that people try to solve depression, because they don't have a medical degree or a counseling degree, they don't work. You can't medicate yourself out of depression because the medications that you have are not helpful. Okay. That drink, if you're depressed, it's not going to make it better. That several drinks, if you're depressed, it's not going to make it better. That way that your life kind of feels out of control, right? And so you're struggling with depression because of relational problems or work problems or school problems or whatever. So you try to take a little bit of control by developing an eating disorder. That's not going to make it better. For kids who sometimes abuse their own bodies in other ways, whether through cutting or through drug abuse, that's not going to make it better. It's amazing. These, and I'll say this very strongly because I believe this, these are just tools of the devil. And here's the way the devil operates. He gives you a quick high followed by a ton of pain. And the quick high is kind of the thing, sometimes we'll talk about how in our world, people just go for the quick win, right? In politics and business. But the funny thing is, after that quick win comes a huge crash. This is why businesses go bankrupt. This is why politics is politics. Well, don't bring that garbage into your life. For the quick high, oh yeah, I feel a little buzz, so I feel a little bit better, or I feel a little bit more powerful because I control what I'm putting into my mouth, or I feel a rush off, some hit that I've taken. Because after that comes a whole bunch, sometimes years and decades of pain. And so don't fall for that trick.
Well, and I guess it kind of boils down to when instead of dealing with depression or mental illness, when instead of dealing with professionals, instead of getting help in constructive ways, when we try to escape mental illness, and in particular, when we try to escape depression, chances are that's a bad habit waiting to happen.
And so, don't fall into the habits. Yeah, because you can't. Depression can run faster than you, and you can't really mask depression either. You can't really cover it up. You actually need help with it. Now, those are two kind of downer points, but here's the good news.
Thank goodness. I
Yeah.
was wondering
Yeah.
when we were going to get to something good here.
The way out of depression, we talked about that gentle whisper that God has, that smallness that God shows up in. Well, the way out of depression begins just like that. It begins small. Here's what you don't need to have if you're struggling with depression. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to have the master plan, right? You don't need to have the huge strategy that will get you out of depression, in 5 days or less, or in 2 weeks or less. We'll often talk about it around here at Concordia. It's just having the next best step. Just take a small little step. Now, this is a biblical thing, and this is actually what happens in Elijah's own story. So God shows up in this gentle whisper, and one of Elijah's complaints is, "Hey, I'm the only faithful person left." Right? We got all these prophets of Baal. I killed them, but they keep on multiplying, and it's just me against the world. And what God finally says to Elijah when he shows up in that gentle whisper, this is 1 Kings 19, verse 18. I actually reserved 7,000 people in Israel. Now, in the big scheme of Israel, that actually isn't a lot. Okay,
But it's a lot more than one.
it's a lot more than one. There were millions and millions of people in Israel. So 7,000, yeah, that's kind of digging in the bottom of the barrel. But these are people whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. In other words, you're not the only one, Elijah. And here's the thing, you don't need to figure out the way out of this whole hot mess, right? You don't need to figure out how to get rid of Baal worship once and for all. All you need is a little bit of hope. So here's a little bit of hope. You're not alone. Faithful worshipers of me, yeah, you're right. There aren't many of them left, but there are a few. And so stick with them, because they can be an encouragement to you, and I will see you through. And that's what depression needs. It just needs a little something, a few people.
Well, and it brings us right back to the closing point from yesterday's message, which is very similar here. That what we need is to have that realization: God is with us, that God cares for us, that He loves us, and that He will meet us in our depression, in our struggles, not rejecting us or judging us or condemning us. He meets us with Jesus, and Jesus is His love for us.
And so the invitation I think that's important is this. God is with you. He cares for you. So if you're struggling right now, do you have a next best step? Is there someone that you can talk to? Is that a promise that you need to, write down and stick on your refrigerator, or put it as a reminder on your phone? What is your next best step to begin to address this so that you don't just get stuck?
So terrific. Great bonus points, Zach. And hopefully the series and these messages on Isolation Bible Study have been helpful to you. Remember, we have 2 more coming up, Wednesday and Friday. And so invite friends. Go back to some of the sessions from before. Look up the series on the Concordia website. And again, hopefully it's helpful as we go through this very difficult time. So right now, I just want to wrap things up. But before we finish, I want to remind you, I have no idea why my watch has begun talking to me all of a sudden. Spontaneous. It happened yesterday during the sermon.
Yes, it did. And just so you know, it's happened to me when I'm preaching too.
So
our watches love to talk to us at the most inopportune times.
yeah, Siri has a mind of her own. Anyway, our encouragement is to kind of take a look at these messages, pass them along, encourage them to other folks. But I want to do one other thing, and I want to remind you that the in-person worship, it's been growing, and the more folks who are there, the more exciting, the more dynamic it becomes. And so tomorrow we'll send out the link for registration. We're seeing the numbers continue to stay down. Things are hopeful. We're working on how to expand the things that are available here on campus and make more things available. But the thing that is going to happen next weekend is worship. And if you worship online, that's great. But if you've kind of been feeling like maybe you need to get back to in person, I was talking with someone after the service yesterday. They actually sent me a note. I had spoken to them during the service, but they sent me a note later on, and they said, we didn't realize how desperately we needed to be back there in person, because it was so encouraging for them. They were blessed by it. Again, we're doing social distancing. We're wearing masks as we come in and leave the sanctuary, but It's a great place to be. And so I hope you'll think about it for this coming weekend. Registration will come out. It'll be available on our website as well. And it's simple to do. You just click a couple buttons and away you go. But folks, thanks for joining us for Isolation Bible Study on this Monday. I hope you have a great rest of the day.